Welcome again to another episode of the NutraDrip GroundWork podcast. Kurt Grimm today here with Nathan Hrnicek has joined me, and we're going to discuss some of our agronomy things that we've got going on at NutraDrip. Nathan, why don't you start out with an introduction of who you are and where you're from and your role here at NutraDrip?
Sure thing. So I'm the director of sales here at NutraDrip. I joined the team about 2 years ago. I was born and raised in eastern Nebraska and currently reside in northwest Kansas in the Colby area with my wife and children.
Very good. And give us a little flavor of some of the things you've been involved with in the past, agronomically related especially.
Yeah. So I worked in the seed industry for about a decade, trying to help growers just think about seed hybrid selection differently. That was in the late 2000s, early 2010s. And there were a lot of very interesting things going on that time. There were some pretty big leaps and bounds made on the yield front. And I think a lot of that could have been at that time really attributed to some significant genetic gains. And so that was kind of an exciting and interesting time to be in the seed industry. And, of course, being in the seed industry, being a seed advisor, that opens the door to lots of conversations around farming practices and, why we're growing our crops the way we're growing them and just different criteria for how we're growing them. And then from there, I transitioned into a role really focused on forage production, where I worked across a pretty big swath of the United States, consulting with dairies and feedlots and their partner producers on just growing the most nutrient-dense forage on their ground possible. That way, not only would the producer win from a tonnage perspective, but then also that dairy and feedlot would also win just from a nutrient density perspective, being able to feed the most satisfying feed stuff to their animals.
Yeah, very good. And here at NutraDrip, agronomy's been part of what we've done for a long time. I think I can go back to the first drip system we put in and thinking back to the light bulb moment for me when we put that in. And I'd grown up raising hydroponic tomatoes in greenhouses where we would tissue sample every week. We would adjust the nutrient mix in the water. We could adjust the flavor of those tomatoes. And it was really, an intense management system. And when we put our first drip system in, there was kind of a light bulb moment for me that now I have that level of control on my field, which we didn't necessarily have with center pivots. So agronomy has always been part of what we've done here and kind of our culture and even how we've built our company. And in the last, let's say 3 to 5 years, we've become more intentional about agronomic processes. So maybe just walk us through a little bit of what are some of the, let's call them best management practices that we want growers to do if we're having a discussion about agronomy and how it relates to fertigation and how they're managing their water and nutrients on their farm.
So I think it all has to go hand in hand. I think a couple of things we've identified is that when you turn on irrigation water, it's not an ideal world in terms of pumping, deionized water or something that would basically simulate rainwater. And so you have to take into account what's coming along for the ride when you're pumping irrigation water. And of course, as you mentioned, having drip and likening that to the hydroponics, we can intensely and intentionally manage how it is we're going to focus and utilize that water, both the positives that come with it. In some cases, we're pumping nitrate with our water, which that's a concern, certainly from a drinking perspective. But as we think about applying that to the crop, we're essentially spoon feeding good nutrition to that crop. But then in some cases, we're getting some antagonisms. So as far as kind of best management practices and some of the things that we would highlight, a couple of those would be, you need to start with the baseline understanding of what your water is and how it interacts with your soils. So we would do that through a rapid soil test. And that's a process in which you're going to have basically collect a sample of that field. You're going to collect a sample of your irrigation water, and you're going to have an analysis done both with deionized water and then your irrigation water to really show you the difference of what is available from a soil solution perspective of when it rains versus when you turn that irrigation water on. There's some overarching trends that we see. Probably the most overarching trend we see is phosphorus availability really being challenged when we turn irrigation water on. And a lot of times that is just simply a cation anion balance equation where that phosphorus is getting tied up. And so as you think about what that does to a plant and not essentially getting those energy cells into the plant, that creates some challenges. So we want to start there. And then as we get into the season and your crop is growing, we want to look at going into sap sampling. And sap is a great way to look at your crop that tells you not only about accumulation, but it also is going to give you a very good glimpse into the difference between nutrient accumulation, but also nutrient mobility. And that's really critical to see how well not only is the plant taking up those nutrients, but how well is it processing them, moving them, and then completing the functions that it needs to ultimately to maximize yield.
Yeah, fantastic explanation there of the steps and some of the processes. You know, you mentioned sap testing. We also had done probably 10 years of tissue sampling. And so we've got an incredible database of tissue samples. And one of the things we always struggled with tissue is making an application or making an adjustment to our fertigation program or even the base fertility program, and it never showing up on the tissue, and not understanding why that would be. And once we started down the calibrated agronomy approach and using the rapid soil test, which is essentially looking at the water soluble nutrients in the soil, not just what's when you do an ammonium acetate extraction or a maleic or a bray, you're looking at nutrients that could become available if there were acids in the soil or root exudates. When we look at a saturated paste or a rapid soil test, we're looking at just what is the freely available nutrients in that water solution. And then we look at that cation anion balance within that. And now we can take and correlate that cation anion balance that's in the rapid soil test with what's in our sap. And I think that's really where we're excited from a fertigation standpoint, is because now we have something that we are able to correlate. We are able to see how we're moving the needle. And it's allowed us to really hone in on individual antagonisms where we have, let's say, I would say 99% of the water we work with antagonizes phosphorus in the soil. And so we go in there, we take a rapid soil test where we've got maybe, let's say, 10 to 15 part per million in that water solution of phosphorus. We turn the switch on and we start irrigating, and that phosphorus goes to 1 or 2 part per million. We just completely annihilate it. So I think that's really been one of the eye-opening things for me as we've learned this process is our irrigation water is not doing us any favors when it comes to nutrient availability for what the plant really needs. Yeah, we're delivering water, but there's a lot of, like you said, there's a lot of baggage that comes along with that.
Yeah, absolutely. And, one of the things that's been really eye-opening to me on this journey was, as we make nutrition plans for our farms and we talk about the different nutrients we're going to apply, we talked about, I'll use nitrogen, as the nutrient that we commonly apply the most from a pounds to the ground perspective, and if we're putting on, say, 150, 200, 250 pounds of nitrogen, we like to think, wow, we're putting on a lot of nitrogen. And theoretically, yes, that's a lot of nitrogen. But then you start looking at what happens when we put on, say, 1 acre foot of water and some of the antagonistic loads that are coming with that. I mean, we've got plenty of water samples that'll show we're putting on 1,000 pounds of calcium or 1,000 pounds of chloride per acre when we're adding this irrigation water. So again, those nutrients aren't necessarily bad, other than when you're putting them on in a heavy enough load that you're causing that antagonistic effect on the rest of the mineral equation. So,
yeah, for sure. Yep. I think the other thing to note is, the general difference between sap and tissue. One of the analogies I like to use is a tissue sample is looking at the accumulation. So it's like going to the doctor and they want to look at what your health has been over the last 6 months. They might take a hair sample and submit that, or a fingernail sample and submit that would show, what's accumulated in those tissues based on your diet and your health over the past time period, versus going to the doctor and they take a blood sample and they know what's in your blood, what's in your vein today, and what that snapshot in time is. And that's really the difference between sap and tissue. And they both have their place. It really depends on what you're trying to do. If you're trying to intensely manage nutrients in the season for fertigation, that sap sample just is a lot quicker reacting, or gives you a lot more insight into what's going on. Maybe touch a little bit on what we've learned specifically about nitrogen, and through the sap sampling and nitrogen assimilation, and how much more information there is related to nitrogen processing within the plant.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd say here over the last 2 years, I've had to unlearn pretty much everything I thought I knew about nitrogen, and relearn it from a perspective that, growing up and even in my early days in agronomy and seed, it was kind of just believed that nitrogen is kind of cheap insurance. You just continue to put more of it on, because that way, if you end up having favorable environmental conditions, you basically have that out there and potentially available for that crop to go reach its top end potential. But what we've really found is that nitrogen, when overly applied, really is a major detriment. And probably, I might even say, maybe the number one yield robber across the Midwest is the over nitrification of our soils and of that environment for which the crop is growing. When we start to put too much nitrogen on, there's a number of things that happen to that plant that make it much more susceptible to disease and pest pressure, which, of course, coming off of last year with the disease challenges we had across the Midwest, that certainly doesn't help the case when we're overloading with nitrogen. When we look at sap, one of the things I love about working with New Age Labs and the Calibrated Agronomy team is when we look at these sap analysis, we're not just looking at nitrogen as a whole, but we're actually looking at nitrate nitrogen, ammonium nitrogen, and then total N. And that starts to give us a clear picture of how well that plant is processing nitrogen from the time of application, and then how long does that take? And that conversion, that efficiency within the plant is very similar to, anything else that we think about in life. It would be similar to us saying we're going to go drive a vehicle down the road. We're going to go fill the gas tank up, but all of our tires are flat. Well, we're not going to be very efficient. And it's the same thing. If the only nutrient we're applying is nitrogen, maybe this is in nitrate form, let's say, as that's a very common way to apply nitrogen, but we don't have the cofactors in place to assimilate that nitrogen to get it to convert to amino acid formula, that plant is going to expend a tremendous amount of energy trying to process and convert that nitrogen. So not only is it going to spend that energy now, but the net effect of that is a reduction in yield and also a reduction in defense mechanisms, because we're robbing future energy. We're burning phosphorus during that process of trying to convert that. And so that ends up just being a net negative. So we really have to be very intentional thinking about, when do we put nitrogen on? What form are we putting nitrogen on? And then are there ways we can potentially even liberate some of that nitrogen budget to bring along some of those cofactors that we know help assimilate nitrogen, so that way we're operating at peak efficiency at all times?
Yeah, 100%. That's really good. What are some of those, you mentioned those cofactors, what are some of the main cofactors that we learned, let's say in 2025, that we need to pay more attention to in 2026 on a lot of our growers?
Absolutely. So I think the lowest hanging fruit, and this probably is a huge surprise to everybody, is sulfur, right? Just as our air has gotten more clean over the years, things like that, we've added a lot of sulfur into nutrition plans, but sulfur is still a limiting factor. And even as we think about how we apply sulfur, is it plant available? So it's not just about pounds to the ground through AMS or other forms of sulfur, but it's making sure that we have that actually available to the plant, specifically at the time of nitrogen applications too, which is why we've seen, an uptick in the application of thiosulfate and other products. I would also say, phosphorus is key, right? We've got to have the energy to do that. And then you've got a couple other ones, some of the micros that are important. You've got boron, you've got zinc, copper, etc. But I think sulfur and phosphate, like, you have to start with the macros. And I'm at a point now where I consider sulfur a macro. It is that important. If you don't have it, your system is not going to work. And so if your macros aren't balanced, if you don't have those right, the micros don't matter. And that's something I definitely learned. I think we definitely learned in 25 is we can spend a lot of time and going back to some of your comments around tissue, I can remember from some of my days doing forage consulting, it was easy to sometimes get hung up when we do a tissue test on some of the micronutrients. And I'm not going to say disregard the macro, but there was almost this like out of balance focus around micronutrient balance. And so if you don't have those macros right, you can dump dollar after dollar after dollar towards those micros and not really see a response either in a tissue test or across the yield monitor.
Yeah. Very good. Off the wall question. What role is AI playing in helping us interpret some of this data? There's just so much information out there. Maybe give us a little insight into what's behind the scenes there.
Yeah. So, wow, that's a huge umbrella, because AI seemingly is integrated into almost everyone's business at this point, which I think is a good thing. I think it helps expedite our learning for sure. It helps challenge our perspective and add to our perspective. And then it also additionally allows for data modeling, analysis of big data sets and trends that maybe is very difficult and time consuming for us to do on a personal level or even a company level, but this just accelerates that so much more quickly. So when you can take thousands of data points and use AI to analyze that, use AI to very quickly identify trends, that's a really powerful tool. Additionally, it also gives us the power, and I think this is one thing that we struggle with at the Farm Gate immensely with, is we have all these subscriptions and all these different technology providers that, we utilize at the Farm Gate, but being able to get them to talk to each other or being able to pull information from each of those and create a central house, if you will, that we can make heads and tails out of all the different data that's coming our way fast and furious. To me, that's one of the biggest benefits and the biggest power of AI as it relates to like right now where we are, is you can take all of your data, dump it in there, and you no longer have to kind of play magician, if you will, between all the different technology sets out there.
Yeah, it just seems to really, I will almost say, level the playing field, or give those of us that don't have as good of an understanding, we can leverage what the smart guys know, and be able to really extrapolate and leverage what's going on. And Calibrated Agronomy is building tools to help us do that, and it's really, really powerful what we're able to do with that data. One thing I wanted to comment on is just, NutraDrip, obviously being a drip irrigation company, on our own farm here in Northeast Kansas, we not only take these practices that we're learning on our drip fields and implementing with our customers, we use it on our drip fields for sure, but also on our center pivots. And that's one of the things that I think we've learned, is that these practices aren't just for drip. This applies 100% for anybody who's irrigating, is just to understand that interaction between soil and water. It's a dynamic system. It changes every day. And as we learn, more and more about the biological function in that soil, there's a whole nother realm to unlock of how the microbiome is reacting in that soil as well, which is ultimately what soil health is all about, right? And so, how we merge what's the intersection of soil health and irrigation, right? What does that mean, and how does that play out over the next few years in your mind?
Yeah. So, up till now, our conversation here today has been really chemistry focused, right? With the rapid soil, the sap, the nutrients and things like that. And it's worth spending time on, but biology and soil health is certainly an equal part of having I believe, the right approach to a very successful agronomy program on your operation. And so we always have to be considering that. I think there's some newer exciting strategies that our friends at Calibrated Agronomy have really helped push the envelope on and help develop. And I think part of what that is rather than just separating everything out and having all these different products that you maybe feel compelled to utilize, some of the approach, I think, is saying we want to overwhelm bad biology with good biology. We want to put enough good biology in that root zone and near that plant that we can overcome some of the soil-borne and environmental-borne challenges. Kind of like, when we play Red Rover, the team with the least people loses. And it's a very similar approach to biology, I believe. And I'm really excited, based on some of the work calibrated is done with reducing fungicide and insecticide use, I think that's critical. When we continue to find ways to improve margins on farms, we have to continually press the envelope and ask why. I think every time we're going to purchase a product, we have to ask ourselves, why are we doing this? And that can be from traditional ways of applying nitrogen, like through UAN and fungicide and insecticide. And we have to be able to answer that question, I think, with a very strong sense of conviction that this is why I'm purchasing this product. And right now, the biological industry is kind of like the wild, wild west. There's a lot of players out there. There's certainly some good products out there. And then there's some things out there that people kind of scratch their heads about. And so my encouragement to everybody is this: if you don't have a strong conviction and a strong understanding of what that product does and how it works, and if you cannot get that clarity, I wouldn't invest the money. I would want to see that clarity and have a good understanding of whatever I'm purchasing before I do that and before I apply it on my field.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's good advice. Sure. Very good. Let's talk a little bit more about kind of agronomy in general at NutraDrip, maybe a few of the other things that we're doing as it relates to soil moisture probes, satellite imagery, and yeah, maybe just give us a quick overview of some of those other options and tools that we have available.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, as we talked about a minute ago, with AI kind of being this central hub where you can take all these different technology systems, we certainly have a plethora of them here at NutraDrip that we utilize and our customers have access to. And you mentioned soil probes and satellite imagery. And on the soil probe side of things, soil probes are a great tool. They're a great tool for saying, I have a physical probe in the ground with sensors that are right there that are giving me readings 24/7 throughout that soil profile, letting me know exactly what's going on. Where's my root depth? Where's my water movement? How do I manage that water movement? Because we know, obviously, with water movement comes nutrient movement too. So we want to make sure we're not pulling nutrients down outside of the root zone. And so we can utilize that. From a satellite imagery perspective, we use a platform called EarWatch, and I love this platform because it's significantly different than anything I've seen on the marketplace. We've got the ability to get near daily thermal imagery with this platform. And that imagery not only makes some nice, compelling pictures, but the story it tells, because of the data it collects, is really powerful. So one example from that platform is it gives you an actual measured ET number from that crop. And you think about the difference of geographies that NutraDrip grows across, from, the high plains and the Ogallala Aquifer through this Northeast Kansas corridor where you reside, Kurt. And then as we get out further east into the Great Lakes region, that ET number changes significantly based on how arid we are, how intense the sun is, how windy we are, things like that. And then even what our water holding capacity is in our soil. So this gives us a tool that we can move forward with tremendous confidence on as far as scheduling that irrigation and finding that right balance. We don't want to over apply. We certainly don't want to starve our crops either. And this is a tool that gives us that balance. One of the awesome things about both of those tools is when you combine them, you can take that data from your soil probe and say, I have a physical probe in the soil that's giving me readings down to, say, 4 foot. And then I have basically a horizontal image layer that I'm laying over the top of that. So you can even look from an imagery perspective and say, my probe is in a certain location in the field. Now, relatively speaking, from an imagery perspective, what is that portion of the field where I have physical sensors at? How does that compare, relatively speaking, to the rest of the field? And I think when you marry those two technologies up, that's about as good as it gets.
Yeah, irrigation water management is such a big topic. It's, using the water we have more effectively, more efficiently. And I think one of the things that a couple other things that we're looking at and worked with a little bit last year, one was an oxygen sensor, where we actually had a buried sensor in the soil measuring O2 levels, and then also a redox sensor measuring the ORP in the soil. And so these are kind of some new tools that we're looking at. But one of the things we learned from those two technologies is that if we only looked at soil moisture, in most soil conditions, we were keeping the soil too wet. And when the soil is too wet, we create an anaerobic condition for roots. our nutrient uptake's not going to be good. We're not going to have a good soil health really for those roots. And so over irrigation and creating an anaerobic condition can actually be detrimental to soil health. So it's really important to understand what's going on in that soil, having sensors that give us that information and give us that window into what's going on below our feet. That's just so impactful. Just to reiterate on the thermal satellite, we use drones, for example, our crews do when we're looking, doing startups on fields. We'll look for leaks. We'll have cold spots where there's a leak maybe, or too much water being applied, and there'll be a dry spot if we've got some plugging or some kinked risers or something. And so the thermal gives us a really quick view of crop stress, and it's just been a great indicator of what's going on in that field. One last thing I wanted to touch on real quick is some of the work we're doing as it relates to manure and agronomy, and how we can take something that maybe is a liability on a farm and we can turn that into an asset by processing it, by making it easier to handle, using it in different application methods, kind of all the things that we're doing with manure. Any thoughts that come to mind as far as how we approach that?
Yeah, this manure as an asset thing is going to be, it's going to be revolutionary. I feel like we're on the cusp of going from doing big things to doing humongous things. Right now, manure is treated like a liability in so many cases, right? Where, hey, we have this quantity of manure that we have to get rid of. And certainly we use it as part of our fertility strategy, on right around livestock operations and things like that. But we can start to now really dial in, thanks to the advancements we've made with manure separation and understanding the interaction of manure with soil solution and in that root zone. We can really start to dial in and hone in better on that fertility plan when manure is included. You mentioned, the O2 sensor or the ORP sensor, which certainly is a big part of understanding manure as fertility and how and what condition we want that soil space to be in. And then also, I think, as a part of the manure separation equation, where we're removing phosphorus mechanically, doing that in that process, it opens up avenues for dairy farmers or hog farmers, confinement cattle feeding and things like that, to say, I can now utilize my manure as more of a nitrogen source, and I'll still have the same limitations on phosphorus, but I can apply more nitrogen to these acres, which makes me have less reliance on, going and buying additional commercial N for these fields. Furthermore, when you look at it through an irrigation sense, as a fertigation sense, you now have that ability to apply manure in season, all season long, to a crop that's growing, and you can really start to get into that spoon feed method. I mean, when you look at what we can do through drip and what we are doing through drip with some of the livestock producers we work with, it's just amazing when you think about, maybe we're applying a couple 100 gallon per acre per day versus the traditional rates of what we normally do, where we're maybe applying once or sometimes twice per year through your conventional manure application methods. And so when we do that, it goes back to some of the things we talked about earlier with chemistry, but certainly soil health. When we go and put the full load of manure on in one dose, especially when there's not a growing crop, we're going to put a big stress on the biology and the microbiome of that soil and even the pore space of that soil. And so this is a much better way of applying it, and really turns it into a way that you can maximize your return as a livestock producer, or even as someone who's adjacent to a livestock producer. If you're not using manure, we had some really compelling studies done last year on some non-manure ground of using manure for the first time in furrow even, and seeing some significant returns on that. And so that's something that certainly has gained a lot of attention, that we're putting more focus on, as well as really trying to connect local farmers with their local livestock neighbors and trying to create a harmonious relationship there, to where they now have a relatively clean product that they can run through their traditional row crop equipment and take the maximum advantage of everything that manure provides.
Yeah, I think that just does a really good job of highlighting, and I think everything we've talked about really like highlighting our approach to agronomy, right? Like it's not just, hey, let's put a drip system in and that's going to be your key to success. The key to success for any irrigation system, whether it's drip, pivot, however, it's the system approach of how do you use that as a tool to help address those nutrient deficiencies, be super efficient, dial in nitrogen use efficiency, dial in phosphorus use efficiency, and really use those irrigation systems as a delivery method, whether it is commercial fertilizer, whether it's manure, whatever the case may be, and then using the right amount of water. So with that, that wraps up another episode of NutraDrip's GroundWork podcast. Thanks, Nathan, for being here, and appreciate sharing your insights.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to the GroundWork with NutraDrip. If you found today's conversation helpful, make sure to follow or subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. Thanks for joining us.